Hi everyone, I'm Ann Cracovaner, a literacy coach in Prince George's County serving High Point High School, and today I'm going to be talking to you about object analysis and getting students to read non-text primary sources within your social studies class. So why do we ask our students to analyze primary sources, and specifically what primary sources do we get them to analyze in our classrooms? I know as a former social studies teacher, my students were always analyzing newspapers, letters, diary entries, and a lot of written texts. But what are we going to do about trying to get students to understand history for people who didn't or couldn't write for a various number of reasons, whether they were illiterate or they didn't have the opportunity or the resources to write? We would like our students to learn about their stories, but the question is, how do we do it if we don't have a written documentation of their lives? When students are able to look at objects like clothing or tools or pieces of artwork, they're able to learn about people who necessarily didn't have the opportunity to write. It also is a really great opportunity for tactile and visual learners to have something that they can pick up and hold and touch in their hands that's a living part of history or another culture. And this also allows you to get your students really truly thinking and acting like historians, especially archaeologists and other site historians use objects a lot to tell the story of the different people they're investigating, and it's not necessarily the traditional written text that you would normally use in your classroom. So now we're going to try it, and I'm going to give you an example using some resources from Mount Vernon's collection. And the question that we're going to be asking ourselves, essentially our essential question, will be, what do these objects tell us about their owner? So the object we're going to be looking at is over there on the other side of the screen, and we're going to work through a couple different exercises that you can do with your students to help them through the process of analyzing an object. The way we're going to go about this is by using this 20 questions activity, and this can be found online on Mount Vernon's website in a worksheet form, but these are just a couple of the different questions that students are going to have to ask themselves as they're analyzing an object. Something like, is it older, is it new, the color, basic things like that, all the way up to, does it remind you of anything that you use today, what happens to this object when it is no longer in use. And not only are students going to have to answer these questions, but they're going to have to justify it using a detail or aspect of the object in front of them. So for example, what is it made out of for the object that we're looking at might be silk or some sort of silky material, because the students would have noticed and touched the object and seen that it does feel smooth to the touch. Or has it always looked this way? Students might say no, because some of the fabric has faded over time. So just like we do with the written text, we want our students to justify their conclusions with evidence. So again, our essential question is, what do these objects tell us about their owner? I would say something like, that they might be from someone who's very rich because they're made out of a very delicate material like silk and beading, that they are probably worn by a woman just because of the height of the heel on these shoes. They're probably worn by someone who didn't do a lot of manual labor because, again, the height and the construction of those shoes wouldn't really be conducive to someone who has to be on their feet all day and walking around a lot. So those are some of just the basic suggestions of what your students might come up with. They could go into a whole lot more detail, hopefully, but just for the purposes of running through this exercise, those are a couple quick suggestions. And who did actually own these shoes? They were owned by Martha Washington, the wife of our first president and our first lady. In fact, these shoes are reportedly the ones that she wore at her wedding to George Washington way back in the 1700s. So this is an activity, hopefully, that is very applicable to your classroom and can be done with a lot of different objects, not just Martha Washington's shoes. Here's the link to that 20 questions worksheet, and again, it's open and applicable to pretty much any object that you'd like to have your students analyze. And then that second link there is to a bunch of the different objects at Mount Vernon. So you can go through and find all kinds of different furniture and paintings and weapons and all kinds of other objects related to colonial and early American history. So again, here's a whole nother list of some of the objects that are available at Mount Vernon. But again, this activity isn't just something that can be used with colonial and early American objects. You can do this with more modern objects from different cultures than the ones the students experience on their daily lives. And you can also do it with objects from even more modern history as well. So hopefully you learned something about how you might get your students to analyze objects rather than just text in your social studies classroom, as well as some really great resources to get students thinking and learning about colonial and early American history.